Hello, good morning, good
Olá,
afternoon,
bom
good
dia,
evening
boa tarde,
to
boa
wherever you're joining us
noite
from around the world.
para todo mundo que está conosco.
It's fantastic to have
É
you
muito,
all here and
muito
taking
bom ter
part
todos
in this
vocês aqui,
live
fazendo
and
parte
interactive webinar
desse
from
webinar
Biogal
interativo ao
Labs.
vivo, promovido
My
pela
name is Jessica
Biogal.
Case. I am the
Me chamo
manager of
Jessica
Complete
Case,
Veterinary Care. We are the
sou
UK
gerente
distributors for
do cuidado
Biogal,
de vacinas.
and I'm speaking to you
Somos
today from
distribuidores de
London.
Biogal.
I
Estou
want
falando
to
aqui desde
make a
Londres.
note and have all of you that are joining us from Brazil and Turkey that we
Estamos com
do
gente
have
de
some
com
live
gente de Brasil,
interpreters
Turquia. Temos
accessible for
intérpretes
you
ao
today.
vivo. Tem
You should
acesso
be able to
a
see
eles.
a button
Vocês
on the
poderiam
bottom of
vê-lo
your
em
screen
botão
that
que está
says language
na
or
parte de baixo da
interpretation.
tela.
There'll be a picture of a globe. If you select
Tem a
that,
imagem
then you can
de
find your
globo
language.
terráqueo. Aí
We
você pode
have
escolher a
Portuguese and
linguagem que
Turkish
você
available today.
deseja,
You can
português
select the
ou
language
turco.
and you should have live interpreters and
Aí
translators
você escolhe
to be able
a
to
língua e você vai
translate
ter acesso a
during
intérprete
today's session.
ao vivo.
It's great to
Ao
have you
longo
all
de todo o
joining us.
webinar.
Welcome. I can see everyone saying hello from
Bem-vindos,
around
posso
the
ver a
world.
todo mundo
Fantastic to have you all
dizendo
here.
olá.
I will be introducing
Fantástico.
Dr. Lise Hansen in a few
Esse
minutes,
aqui, queria
who
apresentar
will
a
be
doutora
talking
Lise
to us
daqui a uns
about
poucos
the
minutos.
practical applications of the
Ela vai falar sobre
WSAVA
as
vaccination
aplicações
guidelines
práticas
and how we can
dos
apply those to
guias
teeth
da
testing.
Associação Mundial de Vacinação
Before I
de
introduce Dr.
pequenos
Hansen, a
animais,
few
para
things to make a
vacinação de
note of.
pequenos animais.
Please could we ask that any questions that you have during
Qualquer
today's
pergunta que
session
vocês
are
tiverem,
typed into the Q&A box.
podem
You should be able to
escrevê-la
see a couple of boxes at the
na
bottom of your screen.
caixinha
You
de
can see the
perguntas e
chat box, which I
respostas
can see a lot of you
na
are
parte de
saying
baixo da
hello in,
tela.
but you should also be able to see a Q&A box.
Vocês
Please
também
could you
vão poder
put
ver
all of
essa
your
caixinha
questions from
na
today's
parte de
session
baixo da
into the
tela. Escreva
Q&A
todas
box, not into the
as
chat box.
questões aí,
And
não na
we
parte
will
do
have
chat,
hopefully some
na
time
parte
at
de
the end of
perguntas e
today's session
respostas.
for Dr. Hansen to answer some of your questions.
Aí
If
depois
she
no
doesn't
final da
have time to
sessão, a
go through
doutora
all of
Lise
them and your
Hansen vai
question isn't
responder
answered,
algumas das
don't
questões.
panic.
Se
Biogal will
algumas
be
não
making a
forem
note of all
respondidas,
of the questions that are put
não
into the
tenha medo, porque
Q&A
vão ser
box today,
respondidas depois,
and these will be
se
sent to you.
estiverem
Dr.
na
Hansen
caixa de
will go
perguntas e
through them
respostas.
after today's session. Once she's had some time to go through and answer all of the questions, Biogal will
Uma vez
send
que
out a
ela
link
possa
to the
responder
recording of today's
todas
webinar,
as perguntas que
along
foram
with the webinar
enviadas, a
notes
Biogal
and
vai
the
enviar
answers
para
to all
vocês
of the
as
questions that
respostas.
are put into the Q&A box. So please use the Q&A box for your questions,
Então, por
not the
favor,
chat
usem
box,
essa caixa
all
de
questions
perguntas e
into the
respostas.
Q&A box. One more reminder for those that have joined us from Turkey and from Brazil,
Algumas
we do
coisas
have
para
live
pessoas que
translators
estão
available. If you click on the
conosco de
interpretation
Brasil,
button, the little globe
clique no botão
logo
de
at the bottom of your
interpretação,
screen,
aquele
you can
globinho
select your
escrito
language and
planeta,
there is
aí
live
você
translation
escolhe e você
for
vai ter
today's session
uma tradução
with
ao
Dr.
vivo
Hansen.
desse webinar de
Okay, we
hoje
should
da doutora
hopefully
Hansen.
have a lot of people logged on and ready to go. So I will
Tô vendo que
introduce
muitas pessoas
Dr.
estão
Lise Hansen.
já
Dr.
conosco.
Hansen
Vou
qualified as
introduzir
a veterinary surgeon in
a doutora
1994 from the
Hansen, que
University of Copenhagen.
veterinária,
She then
que se
moved to the
formou
UK,
em
where she worked
Copenhague,
as a vet
foi
in
para
conventional
o
small
Reino
animal
Unido
practice.
e
Lise now
é
divides her
especialista
small animal
em
practice between the
veterinária
UK
de
and
pequenos
Denmark,
animais,
and she's also the author of the complete
atuando em
book of
Dinamarca
cat and
e
dog health.
o
It's
Reino
fantastic
Unido.
to have you here, Dr.
É
Hansen.
especialista
We're
em
very much
gatos,
looking
em
forward to learning from
cachorros.
you today.
É muito bom
And
tê-la
if
aqui.
you're ready
Muito
to share
obrigado
your
por estar
screen,
conosco
I will
hoje.
hand over to you in a
Por
second.
favor,
One more
compartilhe sua
reminder for
tela
everyone,
conosco.
if you can please type all questions for today in the Q&A box and not
Por
in the
favor,
chat box.
lembrem as
And we
perguntas
have translations
na
available
caixa de
for
perguntas e
Portuguese and
respostas
Turkish
e não
if you select that
no
option at
chat.
the bottom of your screen.
E não
Okay, I
esqueçam
can see
de
the
escolher
screen has been shared
seu
now from Dr.
intérprete.
Hansen, and I'll hand over to you.
Agora vou
Thank you
deixar
very
a
much,
doutora
Jessica.
Hansen com
Thank you.
vocês. Obrigado,
And
Jessica. Muito
welcome
obrigado.
everybody. I'm
Bem-vindos a todos.
in Aarhus, in Denmark. And I'm going to talk about our approach to vaccination of dogs. It's very important to me from the outset to stress that I'm not a research scientist. I am in no way an academic expert in immunology or vaccinology, and I'm not here presenting any original work at all. I am simply going to share clinical experience, on the ground experience, from small animal practice where we have relied on titer testing, serological testing, whatever you want to call it, to inform all vaccine decisions for many years. I was trying when preparing this to work out exactly how many years, and I'm not quite sure, but it's close to 15 years. this has been guiding our choice of when to vaccinate. So it's going to be a talk from the clinic floor, so to speak, and not from the science lab. I'm going to talk about what I recommend to clients and also go through what these recommendations are based on, why we're comfortable using them and how they work in practice. I would also like to share the context of why I consider this such a very, very important topic. I almost see it as a reflection or an indication of the way we practice medicine, really. I do see a discrepancy sometimes between where it seems the science is at and what happens in general practice or in the real world. I would love if we could all be in the same room and have this talk so that we could have more of a two-way discussion or a many-way discussion, because I would love to hear whether your thoughts on this and whether you share this impression that sometimes there is a gap between the current scientific knowledge and what we actually say and do in practice. Okay, if you will... Okay, it's not changing the slide.
Estoy tentando trocar ese slide.
Yeah, that's how it works.
Ahí funcionó.
If you wait very briefly, I'd just like to share as an introduction my own background and why the context is why I'm so interested in this and why I find it so important. I spent a good deal of time researching this topic over the last decade or so, probably. Read a lot of articles and spoken to some of the experts behind them, partly as research for my book that was published last year. The first section in the book looks at the science behind the lifestyle choices that every pet owner has to make, even if their pet is never ill. There are choices that we make, and I have found after very many years in practice that in recent years I've become more interested, on top of course of the therapeutics and how to deal with sick animals. I'm increasingly interested in the advice that we give on how to keep animals healthy and where this come from. How can we help facilitate a healthier lifestyle? So writing this book has been one reason that has prompted me to get on top of the facts and perhaps given me an excuse to set aside the time to do the research. Another has been the great fortune I've had to work for many years in a very progressive practice. A real center of excellence where experts in many fields were involved and where clinical approaches were constantly examined and updated using serological testing as the basis of vaccine decisions was just one example of this approach, really. My boss at this clinic, who was a great source of inspiration, started, if you like, a kind of project, almost like a veterinary after-hours club, where the vets at the practice would get together at the end of the day and look at some of the advice that we give and examine the evidence behind it. So just, what do we tell people? Where does it come from? And is it still valid? Looking at the things that we say every day, the things that I'm sure all of us say in practice every day, and maybe sometimes don't even know anymore where it originally came from. Stuff like the effects of neutering on cancer risk, or what advice we give about worming or tick prevention or nutrition. Looking at why do we say that and what is actually the evidence for it. And we identified these four areas and we investigated them, and we would have one of our meetings and plan who was going to look into what and who was going to talk to who, and then we would meet again and share the articles that we'd found and compare notes on the information that we gathered. And it was a really interesting, really exciting exercise that I can highly recommend. What we found, first of all, is that we were utterly impressed with the willingness of the country's leading experts, who were also sometimes the world's leading experts, really, to take our call and to talk to us. Who in this context is a complete nobody, called my old vet school, and had spoke for hours with the professors there about nutrition and reproduction, and parasites. And I wouldn't want to suggest that they are bored in their academic towers. I'm not saying that at all, but I do actually think that they were as interested or excited even as I was about bridging that gap between the world of academia and scientific research and our world of clinical practice. And I very strongly believe that everybody benefits when those two worlds come together and we examine what we do and why we do it, or maybe sometimes what we should or could be doing it instead. It is it's easy, surprisingly easy, for instance, if you're trying to find out the prevalence of lungworm in your area, to call up and speak to the person who did the PhD on exactly this. And the more I think about it, the more I think that it is much more appropriate to get your information that way than to speak to the sales rep who represents the company that's selling you the wormers. An interesting exercise that I can highly recommend. What we found from this is that partly that there's a lot of new information to dig into, but also that when you examine the latest evidence, when you look at the science, there is shockingly little evidence for some of the often quoted facts that we took for granted, and that I think we all, well, speaking for myself, I certainly tended to just repeat and assume that it was correct, because that's what I'd always said and what I'd always heard. But when we start to look into it, there was very, very little evidence for it. I think all around that there has probably never been a more exciting time to be involved with veterinary medicine. Much of what we thought we knew has changed as new evidence and new studies have come out in recent years. A couple of examples, the advice on neutering, of course, I'm sure you're all aware, has had to be completely rewritten in recent years, following this golden retriever study that was published in 2013, and all the research that has been published in the wake of it has changed the advice that we give about neutering completely. I mean, routine neutering can no longer in good conscience be a general recommendation to healthy animals. Another critical and emerging discussion is about the use of parasite treatments and how the drugs we use to prevent worms and fleas and ticks will need to be much regulated in a much stricter way than they are today. This is an article describing how fish and insects in and around remote rivers in Britain and Scotland are polluted, affected by pollution by neonicotinoid pesticides that can only come from the flea and tick treatments that most of us are handing out as a matter of routine on a daily basis. If you are interested in this, I very highly recommend a new group called Vacinação. Vacinação is a new organization for vets everywhere who work together to improve the sustainability of all aspects of veterinary practice. We are, as a profession, more than farming, where these chemicals have been banned. We are now probably the profession that contributes the most to wiping out bees and flying insects. So we should look at that. I think it's hard to think of a profession that people come to with more passion and dedication than veterinary medicine. I mean, vets are certainly the most committed and the most hard-working people I know. And still, it's not
Eu
an
sei que
easy
todo
profession.
mundo
The
é
stress
muito
can be
trabalhador e eu sei
significant,
que não é uma profissão
even
fácil, é
overwhelming.
estressante.
And the suicide
Muitas
rates
vezes,
among
muitas
vets
coisas
in many countries
superam a
tell us that.
gente.
So I
Tem
think
muito
it's crucial,
suicídio de veterinários em alguns países.
more
Então, acho que
important
é
than it might
crucial.
sound on the face of it, for us to keep the enthusiasm,
Nós
to stay
precisamos manter o
interested and stay
entusiasmo,
engaged with what we do
o
in our daily work.
interesse, o
And
comprometimento com o
that's
que nós
one
estamos
reason, I know
fazendo.
these are complex matters,
E
but
essa é
that's one reason why I
eu sei que
think
isso é complexo,
that it's
mas
important
uma das razões
to
que é
stay engaged
importante
and to
é tu
stay updated,
se
not only
manter
for us,
engajado.
but for our staff as well.
Não
Think
apenas para a
about
gente,
vet
mas
nurses
o
being the
pessoal que trabalha
most,
com a
I mean,
gente.
talk about vet nurses being the most undervalued profession on the planet, I think sometimes.
Pode ser que seja
But if your
profissão
nurses and technicians and receptionists
subvalorada,
are all
mas
fired
nós
up
temos
and
que
well
os
informed, you'll
recepcionistas,
have the
nossos
most
técnicos, todo mundo
fantastic and committed ambassadors for your practice.
comprometido num ambiente fantástico de trabalho, num
Finally,
ambiente
if
bom.
I
Esse é o
may say, I
desafio.
suspect that many of you listening will be younger than I am.
Bom, algumas pessoas que estão
And if I
são
may
mais
offer
jovens
one
do que
piece of
eu,
advice from the
pero
heart,
se eu posso
it
dar
would be that if you
conselho a
are
todos,
working
que
in circumstances, you know, if you are in a
se
clinical
você
setting
está
where you
trabalhando em
don't have clinical
circunstância que
freedom,
você não
and it
tem
is my
muita
clear impression that
liberdade.
this is becoming
Bom,
more
essa minha impressão
common
clara é
as
que isso está se
independent
tornando muito
practices
comum.
in many places become fewer and far between.
Prática independência,
For vets
a prática
to have to
independente
toe
cada
the
vez
party line.
menos
And if that
frequente.
is your reality,
E
if
se
you
essa é a
have
sua
to,
realidade,
if you have procedures or products that you have to
se
sell,
você tem
I would just say,
procedimentos,
get out,
produtos
really.
que te dão uma
It's
independência,
not
então você
worth
saia
it.
disso, porque não vale a pena.
This was just an introduction to kind of put into a larger context why I think that the approach to what we do is really, really important, and why I think being a vet is particularly exciting at this time. Now, let's talk about vaccination.
Então vamos falar agora de
This is
vacinação.
one of the 4 areas that I highlighted before, one of
Esta é uma das
the
4
4
áreas em que quero
lifestyle
me focar.
choices. And it's certainly out of the 4, the one where the information is the most well established and has actually been readily available for many years. Historically, we have used vaccination solely on the basis of the data sheets produced by the vaccine manufacturers. When I was at vet school, there was no independent bodies looking at vaccine requirements in dogs or cats or discussing duration of immunity, or nor did it frankly occur to me that there should be. What happened to change our mindsets was the discovery, I think it was in the early 1990s, of what was then called the vaccine-associated sarcomas, now refers to, I believe, as feline injection site sarcomas, because it has been found that other locally irritant substances apart from vaccines can cause this reaction. And I'm sure most of us have seen these cats. It's not common by any means, but it is particularly heartbreaking because a healthy animal was brought in for a vaccine and probably died as a direct consequence. But the main significance of the discovery of the feline injection site sarcoma is that it was a turning point because it changed the way the veterinary profession looks at vaccines. And it alerted our experts to the fact that vaccines can do harm. They're not just innocent and benevolent and harmless. And it caused us to start looking more seriously at how best to use them.
A ver mais seriamente em como usar as vacinas.
That was the spark and the start of the expert working groups that ended up writing the various guidelines that we have today, but didn't have them. Back then, we just had the data sheet from the product manufacturers, and today we have independent expert advice from our scientific veterinary community, and that's a major thing, that's a really big step.
Isso é realmente grande passo, uma grande mudança.
I'm going to talk about where I get my information, which is the World Small Animal Veterinary Association. They are available for all to read on WSAVA.org. There's a version for veterinary surgeons and a version for dog owners. You've probably all read them. If you haven't read them, do read them. And if you have read them, read them again. I was going to say, keep them on your bedside table and study them. They are, I think, quite wonderful. They are easy to approach and they are totally practically applicable and full of interesting information. And to be honest, compared to a lot of articles that are served up for us in veterinary magazines, this is a seriously well-written document that discusses what is probably the most common procedure for most of us. So I think it's crucial to have read it probably many times. Now, if you already know in your heart that you won't be reading or rereading the full 60 whatever page guidelines tonight, maybe you want to save them for the holiday and read it on the beach. Then start with this article if you haven't read it, which is, you know, you can get through this in a lunch hour. It is an excellent summary of the guidelines by Dr. Michael Day, who was the chair of the WSAVA vaccine guideline group that have written the guidelines from the outset and through all the currently available versions. The article is easy to find online and it gives the background for the guidelines and the highlights of the guidelines. And just quoting from that article, Professor Day describes the reasons the guidelines were written. He calls them drivers for change, and he mentions 3 of them. As I said before, it was recognizing that adverse events do happen. The first one was the feline injection site sarcoma, and later the canine immune-mediated diseases. And that was one reason for looking closer at our use of vaccines and writing the guidelines. Another was a concern from the pet-owning public. I think that there are huge differences. In some places, there are large fractions or very vocal fractions of the public who are very concerned about vaccines, both for their children and their animals. And in other places, it doesn't seem to be a very big debate at all. And the third reason that Professor Day mentions is the need for evidence-based veterinary medicine and I quote directly from the article, the growing belief that delivery of fundamental practices such as vaccination should be based in the latest scientific thinking rather than historical anecdote. I think that's a fantastic phrase. And he says in the article that this is the most important reason that we should strive to practice evidence-based veterinary medicine. And when we do that, such a fundamental practice as vaccination should not be based in historical anecdote. It should be based in the latest scientific thinking. I think that's a beautiful sentiment. And I think it's probably very human, maybe, to be reluctant to change. And it's easy and comfortable to do what we have always done, especially in a busy working day. However, what the man clearly says here is, do you want to vaccinate according to historical anecdote, or do you want to practice evidence-based medicine and practice according to the latest scientific evidence? So that's the question. And assuming we want to do the latter, it then becomes, how do we do that? And no doubt there's more than one way to do that. This is what I do. This is what I recommend to clients, or what we recommend to clients. I'm only too happy to discuss this approach. We recommend that all puppies are teeter tested after the puppy vaccines, after the puppy series of vaccines, they should be at least 16 weeks old, maybe even a little bit older, 4, 5, 6 months old, so that we are sure that we're not measuring maternal antibodies anymore. We are measuring a true active immune response having taken place in that puppy. But we recommend absolutely all puppies be tested following the puppy series. And then after that, straight on to a schedule of repeating the titer test every 3 years. And only revaccinate against core diseases if a test is ever negative. And if a test is negative, I would always recommend that the titer test is repeated 1 month after vaccination, just to check if this is actually a vaccine non-responder, just to ensure when they do get the vaccine, mount an antibody response. This is obviously the core vaccines I'm talking about. I'll return to that in a minute. If a non-core vaccine is indicated for that particular dog that's on the table, then that needs to be repeated annually while it's needed. But this is the basic vaccination approach that I recommend and have done for much more than a decade now. And as you can see, it's totally designed around serological testing. I find it hard, really, to justify repeating a core vaccine to an adult dog without doing a titer test first to check if it's needed. That's how serious I am about the titer test. I do come across some opposition. I'm aware that not all vets approach it like this. These are some of the, as I was thinking about this, to gather some of the very common objections or comments that I hear. And I've certainly heard all of these in the last week, and I hear them almost daily. One is vets saying that side effects don't happen. There's no need to re-examine vaccination protocols because I've been vaccinating for 25 years and I've never seen a side effect. That is something that I hear colleagues say, and I've heard it more than once. Another is that all dogs should have both core and non-core vaccines always, no matter who they are, where they live, or what their living circumstances are. A very common one, probably the most common one, is that titer tests are unreliable because they just show a moment in time. It's just a snapshot, if you like. The argument often goes, so we demonstrate protective antibodies in a blood test today, but who's to say that that dog is not completely unprotected a fortnight from now? I've also heard colleagues say that they have maybe got a test kit into the clinic, but the clients have not been asking for it. There was no demand. I hear the argument that titer testing is too expensive. Often the test will cost a little bit more than the vaccine. And of course, if the test is negative, then you have to vaccinate as well. So why not just vaccinate? And the last comment that I often hear is that it's enough to vaccinate a puppy at 8 and 12 weeks. That's what we've always done. That works fine. There's no need to give any more vaccines or do any testing. Maybe you have other objections, or maybe you hear other objections, but these are probably the ones that I hear very, very commonly for sure. And obviously, I don't agree with them, and I'm going to return to them and go through them one by one. Now, let's look at what these guidelines actually say. I don't think there's any doubt about I don't think anyone's challenging them or disagreeing with them. I don't think anyone's doubting the expertise of the world-leading experts who have written them. I've certainly never heard of any national veterinary organizations or associations that don't fully support them. I'm not really sure who among us in clinical practice would be qualified to disagree with the professors from around the world who have written
clínica, prática, vai
so,
poder estar em desacordo
what do they
com o que
say?
esses especialistas estão dizendo. Então,
I'm just going to share some quotes from them. I'm going to underline the important fact that I'm not making this up as I go along. I am quoting the WSAVA vaccination guidelines by showing exact quotes. So in the slides that I prepared, everything in hyphens is copy-pasted straight from the guidelines. This means that there's going to be a few slides that are quite text-heavy, but I will just flip through them
Espero que não seja
quickly.
muito pesado tanto texto para vocês, mas eu
You'll find the quotes
prefiro
again
mostrar
in the guidelines,
exatamente
and
como
I'll
eles
leave the
falaram,
slides available
para
after
entender
today, if you would like to. It is just important to me
as
to
recomendações dos
illustrate
especialistas da
exactly where these
WSAVA
statements come from,
de uma maneira
and down to
precisa e
the
exata.
exact page numbers in the guidelines that I've added to the bottom of most of the slides.
Vocês na parte de
The
baixo dos
guidelines start
página,
by
em alguns
explaining
slides.
why we need them.
Então, por que precisamos,
And this is my red
minha,
underlining, just to stress the fact that
das entrelinhas,
the guidelines are written to ensure that dogs are protected from infectious disease while reducing the number of vaccines given. That in itself is, well, worth noticing. The guidelines are written partly to reduce the number of vaccines that we give.
Como que vamos proteger se reduzimos o número de vacinas?
This is a quote, again, just about the origin of the guidelines, back to the feline tumors. And they are quoting a time in the past millennium where it was widely believed that vaccines could do no harm.
No milênio passado, era comumente conhecido ou falado de que as vacinas não faziam nada de mal.
Again, we should aim to reduce the vaccine load on individual animals in order to minimize the potential for adverse reactions to vaccine
vacinar animais indivíduos para
minimizar guidelines
minimizar
are written.
reações
For that reason, we have developed guidelines based on a rational analysis of the vaccine requirements for each pet to reduce the vaccine load on individual animals. So again, this emphasis on having these guidelines in order to vaccinate less.
A exposição innecessária
I love the bottom quote. It says, in order to implement these guidelines, and in order for us to vaccinate less, this has necessitated a frame shift in the mindset of veterinary practitioners in a culture in which both veterinarians and clients have become subservient to the mantra of annual vaccination. They're not missing the words. I love that quote. We need a frame shift.
Precisamos
uma
mudança de paradigma.
Everything needs a vaccine every year.
Não pensar que sempre, cada ano, uma vacina é necessária. Pensar diferente agora.
At the back of the guidelines, there's a Q&A section, which is where a lot of the good stuff is. And there's a question here: is there a risk of over-vaccinating a pet? E.g. injecting too often or using vaccines that are not required for the specific pet? Yes, is the answer. Vaccines should not be given needlessly, as they may cause adverse reactions. Vaccines are medical products that should be tailored to the needs of the individual animals. So over-vaccination is a thing. That should be very clear. Ronald Schultz, this is actually, Ronald Schultz is one of the 4 authors of the guidelines, and to my knowledge, one of the first people to study duration of immunity after vaccination, even way back before the 90s. He says vaccines have many exceptional benefits, but as any drug, they also have the potential to cause significant harm. Giving a vaccine that's not needed creates an unnecessary risk to the animal. So again, very clear speech. This is not a quote from the guidelines. This is a quote from the University of Wisconsin Medicine School of Veterinary Medicine website, I should say. Now, in some countries, this is a huge debate. In some countries, there are anti-vaxxers and people who think that vaccines are evil. And in other places, this debate isn't happening at all. I think in any case, it's good to at least be completely, fully informed to be able to have a rational and fact-based conversation about vaccines. This is a table from the WSAVA guidelines listing adverse reactions associated with vaccination in animals. Note that it lists, if you can see my arrow, it lists problems like atopy and seizures. So what it says here really is that it is possible to develop atopy because of an adverse reaction associated with the vaccine. Okay. A couple of quotes to finish off the topic of adverse reactions. They're talking here about the immediate anaphylactic reactions that probably most of us see at least a couple of times a year, I would have thought. And whilst these reactions are relatively easy to identify, it is more difficult to define the adverse reactions that occur a day, a week, or months after vaccination. It is generally only the adverse reactions that occur within the first few hours to a day after vaccination that are considered vaccine-associated by most veterinarians or owners. Even when the adverse reaction occurs shortly after vaccination, there are many who fail to recognize that the vaccine caused the reaction. Certain adverse vaccine reactions are not observed until days, weeks, or even months or years after vaccination or revaccination. So not all vaccine adverse reactions are recognized. This slide, they talk about small breed dogs having a greater likelihood of having an adverse reaction and killed
cachorros pequenos têm uma maior predisposição
a causing a reaction, but stressing the fact, again, this is my
do que cachorro grande, mas isso tem uma variação individual importante. Cachorros grandes que são hipersensíveis também podem desenvolver. Também isso acontece uma diferença entre vacinas de bactérias mortas ou vírus inativados e com antígenos
this is a retrospective study where they looked at
estudo,
owner-reported adverse reactions after vaccination in more than 130,000 dogs. They went through the medical records and checked whether the owner had called the vet back to report a problem in the first 5 days after vaccination. So obviously not a full picture, having just seen that vaccine reactions can happen weeks, months and years after the vaccine. But the risk factors they identified were if the leptospirosis vaccine was included, the risk of that animal suffering an adverse reaction was increased by 2.3-fold, in fact. If the dog was less than 3 months old, and the highest risk factor was the toy breeds. If dogs weighing less than 4.5 kilos had 7 times higher risk of developing an adverse reaction compared to the giant breeds. Dog weighing 40 kilos or more. In summary, it says in the guidelines, page 51, good scientific data on the prevalence of vaccine reactions in man and animals simply do not exist. The main reason for this relates to the fact that not all such events are recorded. So, and adoption of new guidelines is not simply about minimizing the risk of adverse reactions. It is about practicing better, evidence-based veterinary medicine and only performing a medical procedure, i.e. vaccination, when this is required. So, to recap this far, it's clear that we should limit the use of vaccines given to each animals for 2 reasons: to avoid adverse events, and they absolutely do happen. That should be clear from what I've just shown,
quando
though we
essas
just don't know how common
acontecem,
they are. We know that we often don't recognize them and that they are underreported. But the other and more important reason that we should follow the guidelines and limit our use of vaccines is to practice, simply to practice a high standard of veterinary medicine, to practice evidence-based medicine, and to only give a medicine when we know it's indicated. So the vets who say that they have been vaccinating for decades and never seen a side effect probably have not been very good at recognizing them.
Provavelmente não puderam reconhecer.
Recognizing them. They do happen, but whether you're worried about them or whether you're not really worried about them, that's not the most important reason why we should follow guidelines and why we should aim to limit our use of vaccines. So our job then is to judge, as it says in this quote, we should only give a vaccine when this is required. So our job is to be as good as we can at assessing when a vaccine is required. Thankfully, the guidelines are very clear and specific about this. For this purpose and to help us understand what vaccines to give, they divide all vaccines into core and non-core. And the core vaccines are distemper, adenovirus, and parvovirus. In some areas where rabies is endemic or where the rabies vaccination is required by law, that's also counted as a core vaccine. But certainly where I practice in Northern Europe, rabies is only for travel purposes. So the core vaccines are distemper, adenovirus, and parvovirus. And the instruction is clear. The most important message is encapsulated in the following statement. We should aim to vaccinate every animal with core vaccines and to vaccinate each individual less frequently by only giving non-core vaccines that are necessary for that. So everybody needs the core vaccines, not everybody needs the non-core vaccines. The non-core vaccines in common use are leptospirosis and kennel cough. There's a lot we can say about the non-core vaccines. Maybe we'll have time at the end, but my focus here is not so much on the non-core vaccine. Except to say that if everybody needed them, then the whole classification into core and non-core would be a nonsense, really. And it says there very clearly that a main aim of the guidelines is for us to vaccinate less, and the way that we vaccinate less is that we only give non-core vaccines to the animals that need them. That's one way we vaccinate less. The other way we vaccinate less is look at the intervals for the core vaccines. A couple of quotes that talk about this. With regard to adult dogs, it's important to ensure they are vaccinated correctly with core vaccines, but that they are not over-vaccinated or receive unnecessary non-core vaccines. And again, and at the bottom they're saying that the 3-year vaccine license is not a reflection of the true duration of immunity for the core vaccines. For most core vaccines, the true duration of immunity is considerably longer, if not lifelong, for the majority of the dogs. The vaccine guideline group strongly supports the concept of regular health checks, which removes the emphasis from and client expectation of annual revaccination. So we're not calling it the annual vaccine anymore. We're not calling it the annual vaccination visit. It's the annual health check. And there's a lot to talk about at the annual health check, obviously. But regarding vaccination, there's 2 questions really. Does this animal need a non-core vaccine at all? Because not all do everywhere. And secondly, is this animal, obviously if they need a non-core vaccine, they generally need to be given every year. Second question, is this animal still protected from previous core vaccinations?
Então, são duas coisas que, ano a ano, nós podemos analisar nos animais atendidos.
Geographical location. But for the second question, we need to look at the immunity, the duration of immunity from the core vaccines. And that's where titer testing is such an amazing tool, because it tells us what the duration of immunity is for each individual dog. What does the WSAVA say about duration of immunity after the core vaccine? They say, again in the Q&A section at the back, they say what happens to the antibody titer over the 3-year period post-vaccination for canine distemper virus, canine adenovirus, canine parvovirus, and feline papillovirus. That's for another day. The antibody titer will be consistently present at similar titer. This has been shown in numerous field serological surveys of dogs last vaccinated up to 9 years previously, and in experimental studies for dogs last vaccinated up to 14 years previously. So this means, of course, that the concern that a titer test is just a snapshot, just a moment in time. So we demonstrate a titer today, but what's going to happen in a fortnight is not a valid concern, because the titer does not drop in a fortnight. In fact, it doesn't even drop in 3 years or 5 years or more for most dogs. If they have protective antibodies, they maintain
após 3 anos, com esses testes, nós vamos ver que os anticorpos ainda estão aí.
This idea that I certainly had, and that I don't know if we were taught it. It's too long ago to remember, to be honest. But this idea that I think some of us have had at the back of our minds is that you induce immunity and then it sort of wears off, is simply not correct. For the canine core vaccines, once immunity has been induced, the titer remains constant at a similar level for years.
Nível semelhante após a vacinação ao longo de muitos anos.
And again, from the back of the guidelines, can we test dogs as an alternative to vaccination? Yes, certainly.
Podemos
There are
testar
now
cachorro
well-validated, in practice, serological test
para uma
kits
vacinação
that
alternativa,
permit
sim,
determination of the
certamente.
presence of protective serum antibodies specific for distemper, adenovirus, and parvovirus.
Para esses
These
vírus,
kits
como
are used to
sinomose,
confirm protection at
adenovirus,
3-yearly
parvovirus,
intervals instead of automatic
os kits
revaccination
confirmam,
for core
sim, a
diseases.
proteção após
You
3
could
anos, ou intervalo
perform
de 3
serology
anos.
annually, but if you
Vocês
were to
podem
collect
fazer a
and
teste
analyze the
anualmente.
data that you generated within your practice, you will quickly find
Agora,
that annual
se
testing is
você faz isso
unjustified.
corriqueiramente na sua prática,
So,
rapidamente você vai encontrar que
this is what I do.
testar
Take a
todo
blood
ano
test
é
every 3
necessário.
years,
Esse
as I
teste
said
cada
at the
3
beginning,
anos
and this is why I feel happy
suficiente,
doing it. It
inclusive
seems
para
fully
essas vacinações
validated
alternativas que
as an
podem ser dadas aos
approach
cachorros.
by WSAVA.
E esse
Now,
esses são os
this has
lineamentos
been
que dá
checked
a
and
WSAVA.
studied many times, of course.
Bom,
This
isso foi estudado
paper,
muitas vezes.
the data for this paper was,
QD,
the data set was partly gathered from our clinic in London. And so it was dogs that were in for titer testing anyway, just looking at the results that were in the clinic. And they looked at samples from just under 500 dogs, and the dogs had last been vaccinated between 1 month and more than 10 years previously.
Mais de 10 anos, há mais de 10 anos, e
95.7% of them had protective antibodies against distemper, 97.3% against adenovirus, 98.5% against parvovirus, 93.6%
mais de
had
90%
protective
para os
antibodies
diferentes
against
vírus,
all
adenovírus,
3
parvovírus.
diseases.
Para as
So
3
it
doenças mais comuns que o
says
teste
in
pode
the
testar,
article that the
o
objective was to
artigo
determine
mostra
the
que mais de
utility of
90%
the
dos cachorros
in-practice
estavam
test kit.
protegidos por
It was
muitos anos, 10 anos
Vaccitech that
após
was
a
used
vacinação.
to
E eles utilizavam
detect
o
protective
Vaccicheck
serum antibodies
da
against
Biogal
distemper,
para
adenovirus, and
testar
parvovirus in a sample of
sinomose,
a UK
adenovirus,
dog
parvovirus nesse
population.
trabalho.
And the conclusion is that in practice, serological test kits are a valuable tool for informing decision making about canine paw revaccination.
Sobre como está funcionando a vacinação obrigatória nos cachorros.
Authors of this article was Michael Day, again, the chair of the
Bom, dos autores de Michael Day,
vaccine group.
Que é
so the WSAVA is pretty clear. It's a pretty clear endorsement. The vaccine guideline group supports the use of simple in-practice tests for determination of seroconversion to the core vaccine components following vaccination for determination of seroprotection in adult dogs. So
vacinação contra esses 4 vírus mais comuns, que são obrigatórios,
I can't see any reason not to trust the test, really, when this is what the experts say. But let's see, let's look at how it happens in practice.
Vamos ver como acontece na prática, então.
This is the VaxiCheck test kit. I'm going to speak a bit faster. This is the lovely Taya owner's dog who looks like a skeptical model.
A dona parece pouco dubitativa, mas quando tira uma gotinha de sangue, mas basicamente
this is the test kit. It's a
esse é o teste. Aqui é o kit, né? O teste.
Thing.
É pequeno,
sort of fairly low tech
test
to run. You can run 12 in each kit at the same time, or you can break them off and run one at a time.
In this one,
it looks like 4 has been run on a previous occasion, and this time she's doing 6 tests. It's 1 tooth for each dog. Let's get to a clear picture. It takes about, I can't remember, 23 minutes, something like that, where you sit there, this is the previous picture, you sit there and just add the blood or the serum to the first row of wells, depending on how many dogs, how many tests you're doing, and then someone has to sit there. It's always been the nurses doing this. It takes 25 minutes, just under, but you can't answer the phone or man the front desk at the same time. You do need to be focused on what you're doing. So literally sitting there with an egg timer, moving this comb along as the test is run. It's simple to do. There's one thing that I find there is room for confusion. Again, I've never known this to happen if it's a nurse or a technician doing it. But, and if you read the instructions, it's not going to be a problem. But I have come across several instances where vets have kind of thought that they could wing it. And that it ought to be logical. And if you do it that way, there is a possibility for error. In the interpretation of the result, in that you might inadvertently skip the last step. When the tooths, or what do you call these? Teeth. When this comb has dried, here again, so it's 1 tooth for each dog. It is, this is the control, this is adenovirus, parvovirus, and distemper for each dog. So you're looking at the color change. And if you are thinking, this is going to be logical, I can work out how this works without reading the instructions. It has happened more than once that I'm aware of, that someone has thought, surely every dot that's darker than the control is positive. And if you do that, you're going to get a lot of false negatives. You do need to complete the last step of the test to be able to interpret it properly. And what you do is you use the control, you find the color here that matches the control, and then you pull the numbers along, and then you read the rest of the other 3 dots for each animal according to the scale that you get. I'm making this sound difficult, and it's really not. It's really simple. And it's been made even more simple in recent years by the comb cam, which does this for you. And if you're going to embrace these tests and use these tests, you're going to want the comb cam, because then you just, for one animal at a time, you just stick it in, and it quickly gives you, for each of the 3 diseases, it gives you a number.
depois de
So
ver
they'll get a
rapidamente
number between 0
o
and 6.
resultado
So
para cada
it'll
uma das
say
três
parvovirus
doenças,
3,
dá valor
distemper 4,
de 0 a 6.
whatever. You'll get a number between 0 and 6 for each of the 3 diseases.
Você pode ter número
Now, when you're
e a
interpreting
sigla para
this,
cada dos vírus na telinha da câmera.
Guidelines say that the presence of a serum
O
antibody,
guia disse que
regardless
a
of titer,
presença de
indicates
anticorpos no
protective
cérebro, não
immunity
importa a
and
titulação,
immunological memory in that
indica
animal.
sim
So
imunidade
it's not important,
protetiva e
so to
memória
speak, how many
imunológica no
antibodies are
animal.
there,
Então
but
não
the
importa
fact that they are
quantos
there.
antibodies tem, que é a titulação, o título do anticorpo, mas
BioGirl
estando
has
lá,
made
o animal está protegido. O que podemos ver
quick
então
guide, I think they call it, which is
aqui no guia
really
rápido
helpful because it
de
just helps
interpretação, que é muito útil.
stress the fact that you've got to get to the end of the process before you can interpret your
aí
results.
te ajuda a
And
chegar
it's
no
very
final do
simple.
processo,
You get a number for
interpretando
each disease
facilmente, de uma
between
maneira
0 and
simples,
6. If you get,
classificando as doenças
if you get 0
entre
or
0
1,
e 6. Então,
it's a negative test
de 0
and
a 1
vaccination
é
is required.
negativo.
If you get 2,
Aí
3,
você precisa
4, 5
vacinação.
or 6,
Você tem
it's
3,
a
4,
positive
que são os
test
valores que
and the
pode dar o
dog will
teste.
not
5,
benefit
6.
from repeated
Aí o
vaccination.
cachorro não precisa ser vacinado, está protegido.
This is in Danish, sorry. This is
Isso aqui está em dinamarquês, desculpa.
just an example of a titer test
é
certificate. This is from the Danish Kennel Club website. They have put up a template that anyone can print out and use. I suspect most veterinary clinics make their own, actually. But it's just to say, when we then certify the results and give the results to the owners, we don't give them the score. We do the final step and interpret the score, and for each of the 3 diseases, distemper, parvo, and adenovirus, we just say protected or not protected.
Se está protegido ou não protegido contra os 3 vírus.
And a signature, and that's as
Nesse caso,
useful as a vaccine certificate in most circumstances. And of course, it's much more informative than a vaccine certificate. A vaccine certificate just says, I injected this. It doesn't say if it worked.
Aqui, esse
who
fala
knows what might
se
have happened
está
to
imunizado,
it.
se a vacina funciona ou não.
Which meant the vaccines in your fridge are no longer
Então, vocês sabem que as vacinas
no longer do the job, or someone may have left them out on the counter on a hot summer over the weekend, and you know,
foi mal aplicada,
put them back in the fridge, or you might have injected them through the skin rather than under the skin, or the dog might, for whatever reason, not have responded to the vaccine that it was given. So a vaccine certificate just says, we injected this dog with a vaccine, but a titer certificate actually says this dog has been immunized.
O atestado de vacinação só fala que foi injetado,
at some point, and
mas
the vaccine
esse atestado aqui mostra que se foi ou não imunizado,
and it's still working. So just again, this test is completely well, the WSAVA vaccine guideline group supports the use of this simple in practice test, and they go on to say that they recognize that at present such serological testing might be relatively expensive. However, the principles of evidence-based veterinary medicine suggest that testing for antibody status for either puppies or adult dogs should be better practice than simply administering a vaccine booster on the basis that this would be safe and costless. So they are actually saying that titer testing is better practice. Okay. Michael Day, again, I've referred to him a couple of times. Again, he says the guidelines can be summarized in 2 main statements. We should give all animals core vaccines, and non-core vaccines should be given no more than needed. And he also said that in practice, titer testing is our profession's new revolutionary tool. Now, how can we make titer testing available for everybody? Because it is a bit fiddly, and it is a bit time consuming, and it takes longer to run one test than it does to inject one vaccine. And how can we make it as cheap as possible and as practical as possible? One thing is certainly, in my experience, to let the nurses do them. To use the in-house test rather than send samples off to a lab, it ends up costing at least 3 times more if you send them to a lab. Run them yourself, it'll be cheaper, and you'll get the results immediately. If you need to know, you can know after half an hour. You don't have to run them individually. You can run 12 at the same time, possibly even 24 if you've got a handy nurse doing it. Certainly if you've got a student seeing practice or something like that, they can sit there and do it with the nurse step by step. So you can run 24 at the same time. So if you do it at the end of the day or at the end of the week even, and you run 24 at the same time, then this half hour that it takes to run the test suddenly doesn't have to figure so much in terms of getting charging for your time. Run them every 3 years. It's not uncommon to run them every year. And I suppose there's no harm done, but there's just no point really. They don't go negative very often, and as the guidelines said, you can run them every year, but you'll quickly find that it's not justified.
Não se justifica corrê-lo todo ano, o teste pode ser feito cada 3 anos.
You can do tighter events, you know. I find that dog owners get very excited about this. This is not a difficult thing to sell at all. I wouldn't even say that you need to sell it. It sells itself. If you tell everyone who comes for a vaccine that, hey, we've got this great new thing, we don't have to just vaccinate without knowing what we're doing really, without knowing whether it's needed or not, or whether it does anything or not anymore. We can check first. Dog owners are immediately on board and quite excited about it. And some of them, again, it depends where you are. There are cultural differences, I think. That's certainly my experience. But some dog owners are incredibly well informed. They have read the WSAVA guidelines and read scientific articles and will drive across the country to get to a clinic that does in-house titer testing. So dog owners are generally very excited about this, and you know, dog trainers, pet shops, lots of groups will be interested in, you know, either they come as a group and they bring 12 dogs, or you go to them.
Às vezes eles se juntam em grupo, se traem até os que já conhecem vêm dar 12.
I mean, there's lots of ways of doing it. You can go out to a dog group on a Saturday morning, take 24 blood tests. They all go for a walk together while a couple of you run all the tests, and then they come back for the results and their certificates or their vaccine should they need it. So it kind of becomes a party and something that people then talk about. And I think it's easier. I mean, like I said, for dog owners, this sells itself. It's a little bit harder. There's less uptake, I find, for cat owners or cats. Probably primarily because drawing blood from a cat is often more stressful than it is for most dogs. But also, I was going to say cat owners don't talk, and I don't mean that, but of course they talk, but they don't tend to hang out in parks and talk to each other about their pets maybe. But dog owners really do, and they get really excited about this new scientific way of doing things, and it's better for my dog, so he definitely deserves it. So I don't think that it's a difficult thing to sell at all. It's such a logical thing to do, and dog owners are on board with that straight away. It's my very strong experience. Some vets will offer a free revaccination if the test is negative, and certainly after when they are negative, it's very often young dogs where presumably the puppy vaccines never worked. If you don't do the titer test when the puppy is 4, 5, 6 months old, and particularly if you just vaccinate at 8 and 12 weeks and then they come back a year later, some of those will be negative, but they will have always been negative, I'm sure. But apart from those, it's a fairly free guarantee to say that if the test is negative, we'll vaccinate for free. Because
então, essa é uma possibilidade. Bom, deu negativo e a gente vacina de graça, pelo custo do teste.
How am I doing for time? I probably don't have that much. These are some of the situations where title testing is useful. To be honest, I don't spend that much time thinking about when title testing is useful because, as I've described already, I recommend it without exception, really, for all puppies following the puppy series, and then for all adult animals every 3 years. So obviously there are specific situations, particularly in shelters or animals that are being rehomed and you don't know their vaccination status. It's just so much more elegant that you can test rather than just blindly inject them. But generally speaking, we do it to everybody. I can think of a couple of situations where it was particularly useful. I don't know if you are familiar with this breed at all. The Broholmer is a lovely, it's a Danish breed, large dog that was nearly, the breed was nearly lost, and it was sort of recreated in the 1970s from some very targeted breeding. But they're lovely dogs. They come from the Danish castle of Broholm. The story I was going to tell is that we had a litter of these puppies a few years ago now, where they were vaccinated. They had their first puppy vaccine at the breeder, and very good breeder stayed in touch with the puppies and their new owners. They were sold, distributed all over the country, and obviously went to different veterinary clinics for their second puppy vaccines when they were 11, 12 weeks old. And the first one of them went to the vet for the second puppy shot and developed seizures, went in completely happy, started having seizures on the evening after the first vaccine. A couple of days later, the second puppy went to a local vet and the same thing happened. So the breeder, staying in touch, I think they might have had a Facebook group or something, because they all the quite a large litter and all the new owners were being informed about this for sure. So then one of the remaining puppies show up and say what to do. And what do you say? You could say, well, don't worry about it. Vaccine side effects are, after all, very rare. It's probably just poor luck that 2 litter mates started seizuring immediately after receiving their second puppy vaccine. Let's just do it. Or you could say, I really think there must be a genetic predisposition here. I don't think we should risk it. Your dog may have to be unprotected. Puppy classes, puppy school is overrated anyway. We don't dare. I honestly don't know what we would have done if we didn't have the titer test available, because what can you do? No route seems safe, really. But this litter had the first shot, apparently with no problem. So they were actually vaccinated, but they had been 8 weeks old at the time. And we know statistically that more than half of the puppies that are vaccinated with the core vaccine at 8 weeks will respond and will be covered for years, maybe for life. We just can't rely on it, because there's also a significant proportion that aren't. But in this case, it was just very simple, because we could do a titer test of the remaining puppies. We did one of them, and the rest of them found places where they could get it done too, on our advice. And thank God they were positive. So they didn't need a vaccine. And we repeated the titer test, of course, when they were at an age where we didn't have to worry about actually measuring maternal antibodies. We could be sure that we were measuring active immunity, and they remained positive. So we didn't have to run any risk at all. They were absolutely fine. So it's an unusual example, but it's an example where I don't know what we would have done if we hadn't had the titer test available to us. Now, I'm going to skip that story because I promised to stick with an hour, and I nearly have. My question is, and I do wish we could
minha pergunta é,
you know, all be in a big room and discuss this together, because I
todos
genuinely don't understand why there are still practices that don't recommend titer testing. It works really well. We've been relying on it for many years. It seems fully validated. It works. So it puzzles me why it's not what everybody's doing. My take-home message would be absolutely read and reread the guidelines. A main objective of which is to limit the use of vaccines. And the reason we have to read the guidelines and according to the guidelines have to limit the use of vaccination is to avoid adverse reactions and, even more importantly, ensure evidence-based practice. And the way we apply the guidelines and limit our use of vaccinations is that we avoid giving non-core vaccines where they are not needed, and we avoid repeating core vaccines unnecessarily. And for that purpose, the in-house serological testing is fully validated and strongly recommended by experts as better practice and incredibly well received by clients. Okay, I think that was actually, Jessica, what I had to say.
Jéssica, basicamente é isso que eu tinha para falar.
Can I see if I can work out how to stop screen sharing?
Great.
Vou ver como
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. A lot to think about, a lot to discuss. We've had a lot of questions come in, so that was great. Thank you very much for that talk. A couple of the questions that we've had come in, I will go through some of them now, just to say to everyone who has written questions, thank you for your questions. We won't have time to go through everything now, but Dr. Hansen and Baigal will be looking through the questions after today's session, and Baigal will send out a link to those answers along with the recording of this webinar and the webinar notes. But some questions that we've had come through now, Dr. Hansen. There's one from Joao. I'm sorry, Joao, if that's not the correct way to pronounce your name, but Joao asked, how does the titer correlate with protective antibodies and duration of immunity post-test?
I assume the question goes to the level of the titer. If it's very high, you know, if you do the test and you score a 6 as opposed to if you score a 2. The truthful answer is I'm not sure it does. I have not seen any I've not seen any studies saying that it does. On the contrary, I was lucky enough to speak to Professor Day about this, and he said you shouldn't consider the size of the titer. As long as it's significant, as long as it's a significant positive titer, i.e. in the Vacinação test, as long as it's a 2 or above, consider them all equal. So there is no need for a dog owner to feel particularly pleased that their dog scored a 6 or had a very high titer as opposed to a dog that scored a 2 and only just was positive. He felt, or he said, that you should just look at it as a binary thing. They're either positive or they're negative, rather than assign a quantitative value to them. So that's how I think of it.
Okay, great, thank you. We had another question coming from Ali. Ali said, do you think it's safe to have titer testing in countries where rabies and other diseases were not eradicated and are actually quite common due to the amount of stray dogs that were never vaccinated in their lives?
I think it must be safer. I mean, titer testing does not apply to rabies, not in this context anyway. Titer testing is for the 3 core diseases, hepatitis, distemper, and parvovirus. But I think if you have a positive titer test, you can feel more confident that this animal is protected than if you've just vaccinated. If you just vaccinated, you assume the vaccine works. But if you have a titer test, you know the vaccine worked. So I can't say that you run any risk whatsoever.
contra essas doenças obrigatórias.
Thank you. Last question from Claudia. She says, I understand you should not teach a test less than 1 month post-vaccination. Is there evidence that this is so?
That's what I tell people. 1 month. You may know better, Jessica. I have a feeling that the BioGal instruction actually says 2 weeks. I'm not.
2 weeks.
So maybe 2 weeks is enough. I tend to say a month. It would just seem silly to get a negative response just because they haven't fully mounted yet. I'm probably not the right person to answer that, but
talvez não seja eu a pessoa mais apropriada para responder isso, mas
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hansen. That was really fantastic. Really enjoyed that, and we've had lots of participation. Thank you to everyone that's joined us. It's been great to see all your comments and to have you all taking part. Thank you very much to the translators. It was great that we could provide the service to those joining us from Brazil and Turkey. And thank you to BioGal. It's been a great to have this webinar and to learn from it. And we look forward to the next one. So thank you, everybody. You will be receiving a recording of the webinar, the answers to the questions, and the webinar notes at a later date from BioGal to the email that you registered with. So you can look forward to that. And until next time, stay safe, and we will see you all soon.
Se protejam e a gente se vê em breve.